Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Aquarium of the Pacific's Online Academy. My name is Luke, and I'm joining you here from the Aquarium of the Pacific in our virtual studio. And as you can see, I've got a pretty cool habitat behind me. Now, during the rest of the program that we're going to be teaching today, or that I'm going to be teaching today, you can call in, or I should say text in, questions if you want to. If you're curious about anything that you hear me talking about, have observations you want to share, or anything like that, you can text questions, observations, and so on, or answers to my questions into the number 562-286-1838. Again, that's 562-286-1838. Or you can also email us anytime live@lbaop.org. Again, that's live, L-I-V-E, at lbaop.org. And we'll have staff standing by to both answer those questions via text, and if you want to leave your name, you can also have your question answered live on the air. Just give us your first name, and we'll be happy to do that. And, of course, remember, standard data rates and fees and all that may apply as you text, so be sure to check with your parents if you're texting us a lot. And now let's get started. So, this habitat behind me, what is it? What kind of a habitat is this? I'm going to guess that most of you are probably figuring it out pretty quickly because this is one of the most famous habitats in the world. This, of course, is a coral reef habitat. This one, though, isn't, of course, the real coral reef. This is an artificial, a replica of a coral reef that we have here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. The animals that you see swimming around are real, all the fish, the stingrays, and unicorn fish, and so on. But the coral itself that you see in the background is all artificial. That being said, though, we do a pretty good job in this exhibit of recreating what a reef looks like. A true reef might be more or less colorful depending on what time of year it was or where it was in the world or how deep it was and things like that. But this particular exhibit is designed to reproduce the subtropical reefs. Subtropical means just outside the tropics of the island chain of Palau. And this particular spot that it's modeled after is called Blue Corner. Now, I want everyone to take a few minutes and just make some observations about this habitat. What do you see? What kind of adaptations do the animals have? What kind of an environment to live in do you think it is? I mean, what do you think the water is like? What kind of opportunities for hiding or hunting might the coral reef itself provide? Just any observations you might have. Take a few moments and think about some of those. And if you want to, you can even share them with us by just, again, texting in at 562-286-1838. So I'm going to step off here for just a moment. And we're now looking at another coral reef. This is actually real coral. We'll be talking as we go through the show here about the difference between the artificial coral and the real coral here at the aquarium, and some of the reasons why we have real coral in some of our exhibits. And also, of course, today we're going to be getting into the question about conservation of coral, why coral reefs are so important. But first off, I want to hear if anyone has any observations that they want to share. So now we're looking at some real coral. This is a more up-close view than the habitat we were looking at a moment ago. What do you notice about this coral reef? Anything interesting? Anything worth pointing out? What colors do you see? What shapes? How do the animals interact with it? Let's see. So for one thing, I noticed right off the bat that this is a very colorful habitat, right? In fact, the coral reef probably is definitely in the running for the most colorful habitat in the world. Coral reef environments have all sorts of wild colors in them. Because of this particular camera view here, it looks a little less colorful than it probably ought to, just because the camera looks like it has a little bit more blue in it than it should. But these corals are really, really, really colorful. You got corals that are pink, corals that are green, corals that are kind of a yellowish color. This looks like this one's kind of orangish up here. They come in this whole massive variety of different colors. And also the animals that move around them, and I shouldn't say the animals that move around them necessarily, because coral is actually an animal too, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes, but the fish, I should say, and the other animals that move around the coral are also very, very colorful creatures. So this color, of course, is a beautiful thing to look at, but you can tell, of course, that it's a very different kind of environment than, say, if we looked at the kelp forests that we have here in California. Kelp forests are more muted in tones, greens, grays, browns, that kind of thing. The animals in those habitats tend to be the same way. They tend to camouflage with those habitats. On the other hand, the coral reef, being a very colorful environment, also, of course, has very colorful animals. Now, let's see here. We've got some questions coming in already. We've got one about sharks. Why do sharks have different sized teeth? Well, you know what? We're going to talk more about sharks in just a few minutes and how they relate to corals. But I got another good one about corals itself. How many species of coral are there? No way. 1 to 8 million? I was going to say 1,100. Wow, okay, so I've just gotten some impressive... No way. 1 to 8 million? So here I am teaching about coral, but I'll be learning things too. We have a couple folks here that are helping to teach these classes, and so if we include all, to give that a little clarification, if we include all corals, so not just the hard corals like the ones behind me here, but soft corals, deep water corals, all those different kinds of corals, the number of species I'm hearing, this is news to me. Wow, 1 to 8 million species. And a lot of those are, you'll know, that number is so huge, by the way, because we don't know a lot about many of the deeper corals. Corals in shallow water environments, like the ones you're looking at here, and this is where I was going to get my 1,100 figure from, I was thinking just about these kinds, those kinds of corals are, pretty well explored because we spend a lot of time scuba diving and exploring shallow water environments because they're relatively easy to get to. But if you talk about deep water corals, all the time, scientists out there in the ocean looking in deep water environments find new species of corals. They just come across things and go, oh, that's a new species, I think. So when we talk about corals, it's important to remember that we're not just talking about coral reefs, but there actually are a lot of other corals in the world as well, spread into different kinds of habitats. It's not all tropical or subtropical like this. There are deep water and cold water coral habitats. But today we're mostly going to be talking about tropical coral reefs. Now, coral reefs, as I already mentioned, consist of animals. In fact, any individual coral piece you see is the work of thousands, maybe even millions, and if you look across the entire structure, billions of individual what are called coral polyps. Now, if you're wondering what a coral polyp is, you can kind of think of it as a little teeny tiny jellyfish or anemone type thing that basically lives upside down on a rock that it builds itself. When a coral colony starts, you'll have just one of these polyps that settles down onto a hard surface somewhere, or sometimes even onto sand, and then they'll start to secrete a calcium carbonate structure that builds the coral reef underneath them. And this polyp can reproduce, sometimes by cloning itself, so by splitting into 2, and then into 4, and then into 8, and so on. Or other times they can reproduce by what's called broadcast spawning, by sending their eggs and sperm out into the water. So that's how coral reefs start. They start with a single teeny little soft creature that looks kind of like a little jellyfish or a little anemone, and they're actually close relatives. They're part of the cnidarian family. And then that in turn grows into this eventually complex coral reef. Now, I've gotten some interesting questions along these lines. Ooh, these are good ones. So first off, Alexa asked, how long does coral live? Ooh, this is a great picture, by the way. This is either a brain coral or something very similar to a brain coral. You can see why it's called the brain coral. You know how the human brain has all those folds in it? All those, what are they called, sulci and gyruses, I think. This is a brain coral that kind of looks like a brain. So you can see the polyps are these individual teeny little, all these kind of colorful things you see, those would be the polyps themselves, and they're growing this hard, rocky structure. Now, Alexa, to answer your question about how long coral lives, coral is an interesting animal to ask that question about because, like I was saying a minute ago, it oftentimes reproduces by cloning. And if an organism clones itself, that kind of means that it lives forever. Because think about it. If you're just reproducing by just splitting, into 1, into 2, and so on, then when that creature splits, how do you say which one is the new one? They're both the old one, right? They're both the same animal, just that one animal has now become 2. So as long as that cloning process can keep up, that animal really is still alive. And so corals can live a very, very, very long time. And it's hard to even say when we talk about how long a coral lives. We're talking about an individual polyp. Of course, individual ones get sick and can die for different reasons. But if the colony that they created continues to live on, then in a sense that polyp does too, because those are all clones of the same organism. So coral effectively has I might say, semi-unlimited lifespan as long as it stays healthy. Now, I've also got some other good questions about corals before we move on here. Is it hard to cultivate coral? Laura asked this question. That is a really good question, Laura. And we're actually going to talk a little bit about cultivating coral a little later on in the episode. But to begin with, the answer is yes. It's kind of hard to cultivate coral. And London, you had a good question too. Are corals poisonous? Some of them. Some of them they call fire corals. It can be poisonous. I don't know too much about this subject, though. I don't know if there's any like deadly corals or not. But there are definitely corals that are dangerous to touch because they have some venom, just like a lot of the other cnidarians do, like the jellies that are venomous and anemones that are venomous. And also, corals are oftentimes pretty sharp too. Even as I look at some of the coral examples here, when we handle them here, we have to be kind of careful that we don't cut ourselves. So that's another kind of hazard they have associated with them. And then finally, Maya had another great question. How do corals get their different sizes and shapes? That is an excellent question, Maya. And to look at that more closely, let's go look at some examples of coral skeletons, of the calcium carbonate skeleton that's left behind after a coral dies. And we actually have some samples of this here at the aquarium. And I'm going to look at them in my little camera off to the side here, so follow me, everybody. So if we look right here, you can see I have 3 examples of different kinds of corals. We've got a branching coral of some species here. I actually don't know these down to the individual species in most cases. This one's a tongue coral. This is one of my favorites. You can probably see why it's called a tongue coral. Looks like a tongue. And then this is another species here, and you can see if you look at all these different examples that the polyps would be fitting into these in really different ways. I'm going to try to zoom in a little bit so we can get a little bit better of a view of some of these. So you see these tiny little holes in this one? I'm going to see if I can get them in focus. Those little holes would be home to individual polyps. You might be able to see these little dots that are popping up here and there like those. And as these polyps grow and clone and replace themselves and over time, the coral reef gets larger and larger. And then in this one, you can see the polyps would have come in kind of a different shape. They go into these little, I guess, what are these, sort of pentagon-shaped structures in the coral. I can get that on the screen. Which way is the right way there? So there we go. You can see some of those. That's pretty cool, huh? Really interesting texture. And the polyps be living inside each of these little sort of crevices here. And then on the tongue coral, they'd go between all these little grooves in the tongue coral here. Now, why do corals take on these different textures? Well, that's a really good question. See, corals come in different colors for one reason mainly. When you look at a coral reef, you're looking at living animals, right? We talked about those coral polyps. But you're also looking at an algae. Because coral reefs, the tropical reefs, like the one we're looking at here, almost all the corals that are in them survive through a symbiotic relationship with an algae called zooxanthellae. Now, algae, you might remember, it's like things, that little green slimy stuff that grows in pools and stuff like that, right? Well, in the ocean, there's also lots of free-floating algae, what we call plankton algae. And these are little single-celled things that are very much like plants. They use photosynthesis. They get energy from the sun's light, and they produce food from that. And normally they just float around. And this particular family of algae, the zooxanthellae, can be grabbed by coral polyps. And the coral polyps then trap those algae inside their body and basically sort of farm them. They use the food that those algae are producing through photosynthesis to nourish themselves. So the colors that you see on these corals come from those algae. And the different kinds of algae that they're pulling in, the different species or the different properties that the individual corals have will then determine what the color is. But when these corals eject those algae, which happens in certain dangerous situations for coral that I'll talk about in a little bit, corals will basically be white, a very, very pale color when they eject their algae. So all that bright color that you're seeing is actually mostly thanks to the algae that the coral collects. And we have some other good questions here. Bella asked, what animals eat coral? So in the natural coral reef, right, corals do have predators. This is a really good question, Bella. And here in this exhibit, we might have one of them around. I don't know for sure, but if you've ever seen a parrotfish before, a parrotfish, such as this guy, is a very good example of an animal that eats coral. Take a look at these. This is a great picture. Take a look at these teeth. So, for one thing, parrotfish teeth are always kind of weird because they almost look sort of like human teeth to a certain degree. But if you looked at them more closely, these teeth are basically these big fused hard plates that are continuously growing throughout the parrotfish's life. And what the parrotfish does is it actually goes along and eats the coral polyps. Now, in order to do that effectively, it basically just scrapes the surface of the coral, so it wears down its teeth pretty rapidly as it does that. This fish has to constantly grow more teeth, or get its teeth kind of keep growing back in, kind of like a rodent does. You know how rodents always have those long teeth that keep growing throughout their lives? The parrotfish, similar adaptation. So the parrotfish munches on the coral as an example of a coral predator. There's also things like the crown of thorns sea star, which is a pretty pretty crazy looking sea star with a bunch of big spikes that prey on corals as well. They basically go over the coral and regurgitate stuff onto it. And then there's other animals that do similar things. There's other fish that have a lifestyle similar to the parrotfish that might nibble on coral. But there's even more animals that live in the coral and depend upon it to survive. We had another good question. Andrew, what is the biggest type of coral? That's a hard question to answer because corals come in these massive colonies, right? And the biggest coral colonies are probably those in the Great Barrier Reef off the eastern coast of Australia. So in a sense, I guess you could say, if that's what you mean, that's the biggest type of coral. But if you mean what individual coral species grows into the biggest reef, I don't actually know. What's the largest coral colony maybe ever found? That's a tough question. And then also there's coral, the massive, what, the ring corals? What was that? Oh, brain corals, yeah, okay. So brain corals such as these, I mean, you can kind of see from the picture, are some of the largest ones that grow kind of individual colonies. And these things can be many feet across. They get very large. If they're in a healthy environment, they can thrive for a long period of time. So that might answer the question too. And then also you can think about what size the polyps themselves are. Because in a lot of corals, the polyps are so small you can barely see them unless you have a microscope. But in other coral species, the polyps are sometimes quite big and pretty easy to see. So if you're going by polyp size, then it'd probably be, I have to think about that one too. We have some here at the aquarium that have pretty large polyps, but I can't remember the names of the species off the top of my head. Now, where were we? We were talking about corals and the animals that depend on them. So let's talk about that actually a little more. We've spoken about coral reefs in general, what coral is, how coral works. We haven't talked too much yet about the entire ecosystem that the coral reef supports. So if you've heard the term ecosystem before, you might know that it's this very scientific term for the interactions that exist between many, many different organisms to create a more or less kind of stable environment. And it's a system of interactions that are interdependent in very, very complex ways. And when we talk about ecosystems, we usually describe them as locations or as types of ecosystems. So we would say this is an example of a coral reef ecosystem. The ecosystem off our coast might be sometimes, temperate, shallow water, sandy bottom ecosystems, or kelp forest ecosystems. And these different kinds of places, you'll notice, are oftentimes named after some sort of large stationary organism that grows there, something like a coral, something like a kelp forest. And in turn, those things sort of form the foundation around which all the other animals in the ecosystem kind of begin to really develop their lives and evolve and learn how to live. So corals form the basis of the coral reef ecosystem, which is in turn home to thousands and thousands of different species of vertebrates and invertebrates. And those vertebrates can include fish, mammals, birds, reptiles. The list goes on and on and on. And these habitats are all dependent, once again, on this coral reef itself. Now, it looks like Laura had a few more questions about corals and algae and how the symbiosis works. So let me see if I can describe it a little bit more. So you've got this individual coral polyp, right? And this coral polyp, which would be just a tiny dot on one of these things, or maybe in these cases a little bit larger. You can see some of the individual polyps there. Those coral polyps, while they're sitting around in their day, wait for these algae called zooxanthellae to float by in the water, right? And the coral polyps actually have the ability to capture these algae. Once they capture them, they store them inside their body, basically in between their own cells. And then they grow them. And since the corals are close to the surface, the algae are able to reproduce inside the coral, and the corals can then take a lot of the food that the algae grows as they're performing photosynthesis. And this is essential to the life of the coral. It's not essential to the algae, by the way. There used to be some controversy about this among scientists, because scientists would say, well, does the algae get a benefit from being held onto by the coral? And based on what we now understand about it, the answer is basically no. The algae actually are probably better off. And I know this is not to say the poor algae are being taken advantage of or anything, but in a scientific way, I guess they are. The corals basically trap them in their bodies, and then the algae do not get to reproduce as quickly when they're trapped inside the coral as they would if they were just floating around. So the corals kind of are just grabbing the algae and kind of holding them prisoner. But it's no different than farming or anything else, because after all, we are just talking about some algae. But it is an interesting relationship. The coral gets a lot out of it. The algae gets to continue to survive, but doesn't doesn't necessarily survive as well as it would if it was out in the open water. Now, finally, this is another question. I'm not sure if I exactly know how to answer this one. How many times can coral reproduce? Bella asked this one. So coral reproduced, like I said, two different ways. There's cloning, where they just basically split, and then there's also reproduction through broadcast spawning, where they release sperm and eggs into the water. Those what we call gametes, and then those two gametes, they meet each other. They eventually form a little basically a little polyp larva, and that eventually settles on a rock somewhere and then grows into a coral colony. And I don't know if there's a particular number of times that a given coral polyp might be able to reproduce or clone in its lifetime. I know I said they're effectively immortal, but it might be the case that a given coral colony, in practice has some sort of limit on how many times it's likely to clone successfully before it dies, and maybe then from that point it has to reproduce sexually, or if it wants to at least continuously. But that's a really complex question that's going to be a very case-by-case sort of thing, depending on the species of coral and how long we've had a chance to study it. And oftentimes when we get these questions about how long a thing lives, for some kinds of organisms, it's really hard to answer that question, because it's even hard, for example, with the coral, to define what you mean when you say the thing. When you say how long does a coral live, like, well, you mean how long does this individual coral colony live? Or do you mean how long does an individual polyp live? Or do you mean how long is it between cloning cycles? So it gets kind of complicated. But when we're talking about corals, it's usually most helpful to think of them in terms of the colonies rather than in terms of the individual polyps, because the colonies persist for long periods of time. The colonies are the structure around which all this other ecosystem activity develops. The individual polyps build those colonies, but oftentimes it's hard for us to talk about those polyps and kind of think of them in the same way that we think of the reef. I know that this is, like I said, this is complicated stuff. So let's get back, though, to some of the questions about the animals that depend on corals to live. So we got these coral reef environments, right? And a few animals actually eat the coral. But mostly, the animals that live in and around the coral reef do so because it's full of wonderful places to hide and to nest and to lay eggs. Or if you're perhaps a larger animal, maybe it's full of wonderful places to look for animals that might be hiding or nesting and things like that you can maybe eat. So if we go back to our big trop cam here, we can look at some of the larger animals that might call this habitat home. So you think about it, if this is a real coral reef, and all the little nooks and crannies, there'll be all sorts of invertebrates and fish and stuff living. And then the next step up the food chain would be that there's some larger animals, mostly fish, but also things like reptiles and even birds and so on, that are going to be going around looking into the coral for things to eat. And then it just goes on up from there. Eventually you get even bigger fish that might be feeding on some of those kind of mid-sized fish that are eating the really small ones. And these ecosystems are complicated and really, really opportunistic. A lot of the animals that you see in this exhibit will eat pretty much any piece of meat that they can grab onto and get in their mouths and swallow successfully, because this is actually an environment where, believe it or not, free food is very, very scarce. In some parts of the ocean, like off our coast, for example, where the water is kind of murky, there's actually a lot of loose nutrients just sort of floating around in the environment because of all that stuff you see floating in the water, that kind of murky water. That's actually oftentimes things like nutrients that kelp forests might use to grow, that plankton can grow from. In coral reef environments, there's not a lot of free nutrients floating around, and you can tell because the water is so clear. The reason the water is so clear is because basically almost everything available is trapped in the living things themselves of this reef. There's not a lot, and when we talk about those living things, there are a lot more things that you can see. There's not as many plankton and stuff like that as you'd find, say, off our coast. And so these animals are constantly looking for something available to eat. And they'll take advantage of any situation they can where they think they might be able to get kind of a leg up on something that's edible to them. And this is why if you go look for great dive videos online, you can find all sorts of unexpected and weird things happening, like videos of, like, say, moray eels trying to eat a shark, or, and things like that, where these are situations that might be rare, but weird stuff can oftentimes happen in coral reefs because of how opportunistic these animals are and because of how hard it is to come by a free meal in this really, really robust and really, really rich environment. And let's see here. Ooh, I think I have another question. Ooh, I got a correction on my parrotfish thing. So I was talking about the parrotfish eating coral polyps. Apparently, parrotfish actually eat dead coral, and they eat detritus inside the pores of dead coral. I didn't know this. I've learned something new. So this is, okay, so if you're not familiar with what detritus is, Detritus is basically a term we have for any sort of biological goop and gunk that has come from animals, from dead animals, from rotten plankton, from anything that, probably that was sort of once living that's now just fallen onto the ground or the environment of the ocean or is floating through the water. And in these in corals, when corals die, all sorts of that detritus, of that just sort of leftover organic material settles in all the cracks and crevices. And apparently, this is what parrotfish eat. I've been going around misunderstanding that for a long time. So you see, we all learn things every day here at the aquarium. There's not a single day that goes by that I don't learn a new thing working here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. It's a lot of fun. Now, I want to talk now, though, about that last thing that I said I was going to discuss earlier. We were going to talk about coral reef conservation. So coral reefs, as you probably know, are among some of the most vulnerable habitats in the world. Coral reefs came to exist in environments that are pretty stable. The weather doesn't, I shouldn't say the weather, the temperature of the water doesn't change much over the course of the year for corals. So a coral reef, oftentimes, a tropical coral reef or a subtropical one like this, might experience a swing in temperature of only a degree or 2 or 3 degrees over the course of its usual year. And this means that those corals have really dialed into exactly how they have to live to survive at those temperatures. Now, as temperatures in reef environments change, in particular as they've gotten warmer because of climate change over these last decades, the coral reef environments have been having trouble because those temperatures are oftentimes going above temperatures at which they can survive, temperatures they've never had to experience before, or at least not experience for long periods of time. And when corals encounter those kinds of situations where the water is too warm, or sometimes there's too many nutrients in the water, or sometimes there might be overfishing that's reducing some of the essential relationships the corals have with some of the other organisms that live here, then that can mean that the coral reef can actually die off. The most famous example of this is coral bleaching, which is what happens basically when corals get too warm. The algae in their bodies start to produce too much oxygen, and too much oxygen is actually toxic, even though oxygen in the right amounts is a good thing. So the corals will actually spit out their algae effectively. They'll just sort of eject them from their bodies, and then they'll all turn white, and that's what we call it coral bleaching. And if the conditions don't return to a healthy temperature soon, allowing the corals to sort of kind of take those algae in again, then the coral reef will just die off. And this is happening in huge amounts of coral reef. So what can we do to help protect coral reefs? Well, one thing, we can work to mitigate, to slow down, to reduce climate change. The more our environment warms up, the harder it is going to be for coral reefs to survive. We're already seeing coral reefs shrinking all around the world in the places where they occur. Also, we can do things like reducing ocean pollution, making sure we're eating sustainable seafood, but there's also going to have to be efforts to try to restore some environments that have already been lost. And that's one of the things that we're beginning to work on here at the aquarium through a program we call SEACOR. SEACOR is a global collaboration between a bunch of aquariums and universities and research institutions and stuff like that that is working to figure out ways to kind of help coral to survive these disruptions that are happening in their habitats. And it works in a really, really interesting way. So the way we do SEACOR basically is, you can see a picture of some of these behind me. I have another one in my hand. Let's say you've got a coral reef that's not really a healthy environment for new corals to grow, right? And maybe there's corals that are still spawning there. They're still sending their eggs and stuff out of the water, but those baby polyps aren't able to settle and really grow into healthy reefs. We take a whole bunch of these things, they're called tetrapods, and we put them in those habitats and leave them there for a year or two. And if you do that and leave it through a few spawning events, a couple of little baby coral polyps might grow on the little tetrapod. Now the problem in these environments is that because they're so unpredictable these days, because they're changing so much, these coral polyps never really get the chance to grow into full colonies. They're just dying off, and you're not seeing new reefs grow to replace the ones that have been lost. But what the SEACOR program tries to do is to then take these little tetrapods with the little baby corals growing on them, and this one hasn't been used yet, so this is just basically ceramic. And then we take them to to a place where we can put them in basically a healthy, artificial environment, like an aquarium, and that's what you're seeing in this picture. Then we grow those little baby polyps into coral colonies, and the eventual idea is that those coral colonies, once they're nice and strong and big, can be outplanted to areas that might allow them to kind of act as seed populations to kind of restore areas of coral reef where we think the environment might be maybe not stable enough for the babies to live, but maybe stable enough for a more healthy colony to live. And eventually, this program is also going to work to find out if there's ways we can make coral just in general more resilient to rising temperatures, Can they learn to tolerate them over time? There's all sorts of questions that we need to answer about coral if we want them to be able to survive in the environments of the future. So the program that this aquarium has been working with for the last few years, Seacor, is just the beginning of something that's going to be going on maybe forever, to be totally honest. I don't think Seacor has any end in sight. If we want to save corals, we're really going to have to keep working on this for a long, long time. We're only at the beginning of this now. And this is Danny, one of our curators here at the aquarium, doing some work on the Seacor program, looking probably at a coral polyp or something through the microscope there. And we're almost out of time. So before we wrap up, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the questions we've gotten. So where do corals get the calcium carbonate to build their skeleton? Now, I've got to warn you, first off, Laura, this is a really good question. Before I answer this, I'm not a chemist, so I'm going to do my best. But essentially, in any ocean environment, there are free-floating chemicals present. And there's lots of different organisms that can use those components, such as calcium, such as carbon, blah, 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 to build the shells that they need to survive. And it's not just corals that do this. The other example would be snails, clams, all those different hard-shelled mollusks, same way. Now, they want to grab that stuff out of the water, so they eventually can assemble it into calcium carbonate skeletons or shells that they use to live in or live on. But the problem that a lot of these animals are having today is that the same process that's causing climate change, that is the increasing amounts of carbon dioxide, the rampant release of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere because of the burning of gasoline and oil and coal and stuff like that, is also not just warming up our atmosphere, but is also having the effect of making our oceans more acidic, which is basically reducing the availability of the building blocks that animals like this clam or like these corals around it use to build their shells and their skeletons. Now, I know that's kind of complicated sounding, but imagine that you want to build a house, right? And in order to build a house, you have to have nails, you got to have wood, you got to have all these things you can put together to build that house. Now imagine you've got yourself a nice pile of stuff that you're going to build your house with. You got all the wood, all the nails you need, all the paint and everything. But as you're trying to build that house, somebody is coming and just taking pieces of your pile of building materials and just taking them away. So every time you come back to your pile of building materials, there's less stuff there. And you're like, well, I was going to build a wall over here, but now my whole stuff I was going to build the wall, it's gone, so I can't build the wall now. That situation is basically what animals in the ocean that build shells and calcium carbonate skeletons are experiencing. They try to build their shells using the materials that are naturally available in their environment, but because of ocean acidification, those materials are not as available. And so they're just finding they can't build the strong shells they used to. And if this keeps up, it's eventually going to become very difficult for a lot of these animals to build shells at all. And we've done actual lab experiments on this and that have shown that if the ocean keeps on getting more acidic, it's going to be a scary time. So this is yet another dimension of the challenges facing coral reefs and facing any other animal with a calcium carbonate shell in the ocean. Now, we are just out of time, it looks like, but we're going to be back in about a half an hour with a squid dissection. So if you want to check that out, please rejoin us. Remember, you can continue to submit questions via text at 562-286-1838. Or you can email us anytime at live@lbaop.org. So if you think you have a question, if you come up with a question later, or if you're watching this and it's not live, you can still use that email live@lbaop.org, and we regularly check that and respond to questions that we get. So join me again at our 2 o'clock spot for a squid dissection. That'll be, I think, a different link. So go check the invite on our Facebook or our website. And thank you very much for joining me to learn about coral reefs. Have a great day, everybody.